Hey there, hope you're doing good. Let's continue refactoring Futurecam. Let's see what we can do now. These are the tasks, and many of these were created during prior refactorings as it happens. Let's start by staring at a blank VS Code screen. Okay, no. Let's start by evaluating this function. We have an AV capture device and an AV capture device input here. And this is just to recap what we discussed earlier. AV capture device has a bunch of properties for each camera, wide, tele, front, as does input. These are computed properties, which means they are a function with the syntax of a variable. These are not a problem, they don't introduce state, but these are problematic. These are global variables and we don't like global variables. So what do we do about them? Now there are many uses of these global variables. We are trying to eliminate them one by one. There is one called corresponding input, which has only one usage. How does it work? It iterates through all of the device inputs and finds out which is the corresponding input for a device. It has only one user, who is the set device function. So now what I want to explore, and refactorings are explorations. If you have 10 ideas, 7 of them will work, 3 won't, which is completely fine. So what I'm trying to explore here today is, can we get rid of corresponding input? Because it's like a bad design. It depends on a global variable, which means you can't get rid of the global variable as long as this is there. So we're not going to get rid of the global variables in this commit, but we are going to see if we can get rid of this. And the way we get rid of this is by taking the device input as a parameter here, rather than doing it the other way around. Basically, if you step back far enough, both of these represent a camera. The device represents the camera, the input represents, well, again at a high level camera, but at a lower level an input which can be plugged into a session. So the session has inputs and outputs. If you think of the AV capture session as a box with arrows coming into it, those are the inputs, and it has arrows going out, which are the outputs. So anyway, this would be new input. And are we using new device anywhere here except for I want to see a git diff of what all happened in these lines of code. Maybe I'll go to blame. Blame is a funny term, isn't it? We techies use it to mean something different from what ordinary people use it. Early in my career, I used it in a meeting like this, the blame goes to him. And he was like, no, no, we shouldn't blame. I was like, no, that's not what I mean. I mean, if you look at the lines of code, that's what were changed. So, var device. So 185. There's only one person to blame here. Okay, this is returning what the session is configured. Okay, fine. Okay, well, let's keep the blame open in case we need it. Oh, it has disappeared. Okay, it's there. Fine. So this function in the camera change, you're setting the device to the current one once again, which is odd. So you can see we have changed the direction of mapping. Earlier we took a device and then we found out the input. Now we are taking an input and going to the device. The device input has a property. So this is not a global variable, it's an instance variable of this. So this is a cleaner design in that way. So the thing is, I am not very happy with this code, setting the device to the current one. For side effects, what all you want to change, only those you should change. Yeah, okay, so now question is, can you ask the session for the input? Yes, you can. Session dot inputs. Let's have a convenience function in session. This file is accumulating a whole bunch of extensions, but that's okay. Var device. Oh no. You can use a higher order function like where, but then you'll have to cast it again. So you can do something like return inputs dot where $0 is AV capture device input. So this will eliminate the loop, but then you have to force cast it again as AV capture device input. Like in one sense it's cleaner, the loop mechanics are gone, but in another sense it's worse, the typing. So I'll choose the type safe code. Let's be more precise what is not found in the session. This is no longer optional. Earlier it used to oh, earlier it had a verification failure. If no camera was found, we randomly returned wide. Now we are going to do a fatal error. If it actually happens in production, we'll investigate why and fix it. If you do it this way, you have to have a fallback code. So there's always a debate about defensive programming. Some people say, and for a good reason, that defensive programming hides errors. And also in terms of tooling, if this happens in an iPhone app, Apple's tooling will catch. And it will get uploaded to the Apple servers. And when you as a developer log into App Store Connect, which is like a developer portal, you will get all the statistics. How many crashes happened, how many crashes happened with each given message or stack trace, and it will tell you like this crash has happened 18 times, that crash has happened only once, so that you can prioritize. So all that happens. If you continue running and log it, then you have to build your own infrastructure. In this case, we used / misused Firebase Analytics for this. But then you still have to go to Firebase Analytics and check. If the number of errors is increasing, you won't know because Firebase Analytics may not give you that alert. Whereas if you make a crash, then you'll get better alerting. So App Store Connect may say that the crashes have increased or whatever it is, right? So anyway. This should also be removed. Who is invoking camera changed? What do they want? Can they do what they want directly instead of telling the camera class that the camera has changed and letting the camera class figure out? So can we move the logic elsewhere is the question. So this is one caller of set device. This is another caller. This is the frame producer. So when you have a function like corresponding input, you use it as a crutch, you call it randomly wherever. When you remove it, you make changes in other places. It has to be one of these. Okay, whatever. Do we have a session instance variable here? Guess not. Well, why not? So this function, it accesses the device like it used to and checks for a bunch of cases and returns the next device input to use. Okay, nobody else is using next device for time lapse. We need to check who. There was one more call of set device. Here we go. Yeah, this code really needs to be cleaned up. It locks focus for multiple cameras and starts recording, but we don't have that functionality anymore. If that were cleaned up, this would be easier, but then yeah, you can't tackle everything at once, so we'll suck it up for now. Sorry for the alarm ringing. So, you have to think about what to do with this. One is we can make the delegate return a camera device input instead of a device. But then that's a bigger refactoring. These refactorings, often A requires B requires C requires D, and you start at A, then you do all the others, and then it becomes too much of a change to commit in one go. Then you have to put it aside and start with D. Let's do this. Let's bite the bullet. Get rid of these global variables. Because that is the goal of this refactoring, right? If it turns out to be too much, we will abandon it or whatever, right? Break it into pieces, or we'll figure out what to do next. But for now, let's start with the goal. The goal was never to remove corresponding input. So here I removed this, but this is not the goal. This is only one step towards the goal. The ultimate goal is to remove these global variables. Oops. Let's start with the goal and work backwards. Let's remove this junk actually. This is coming in the way of this refactoring. This should be an easier change to make. So let's hit the browser. VS Code. This link sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work. It's valid for a day or so. See? Doesn't work. Then you have to do file. Close editor, I guess. Oh, it's working now? Strange. Oh, it's still loading. Weird. Okay, whatever. So here, what we want to do, we want to get rid of the camera switching code. Is this the place we are looking at? Yes, frame producer. So each time we capture, we switch the camera. So a camera has multiple, a phone has multiple cameras, right? Wide and tele and ultra wide. We wanted to capture a time lapse simultaneously with all three cameras. That is a feature we wanted to build in Futurecam. And the goal is that, so the reason this works is, and works without any support from the system, is a time lapse is basically a sequence of images captured over tens of minutes or hours. And in order to do that, you have plenty of time. So you can take a photo. So let's say you're capturing a photo every 10 seconds. Instead, you can capture a photo every 3 seconds with 3 cameras. And you have a lot of time. So that was the motivation for building this feature. So if you imagine the sun setting over the horizon, you may want a zoomed in view of the sun. You may have a wide angle view of the sun, the sky, the horizon, the buildings and everything. And you may want to have an ultra wide view that includes the garden below and kids playing in it. So if you're not sure which one works best, capture all 3 and later delete the one you don't like, keep maybe 2 of them. That was the motivation. What actually happened with this feature is, it didn't work well. There were exposure shifts because the camera is not designed to be used that way. And this is a complicated problem with time lapses. There are complicated algorithms built. There's like a $300 app that is built to normalize these brightness levels and so on. Because when you capture a video, like a normal video, not a time lapse, the brightness is more or less constant between frames because the system is designed for that. So even if you take one photo, the there is a range of valid brightness values that can be used, all of which look good. I mean, obviously, if you make it too bright or too dark, it doesn't look good, but within a range. When you capture a video, it's not a question about each frame in isolation. It's a question about whether the frames fit together without brightness going up and down as the video plays, which manifests as flicker. So that is taken care of in a normal video. In a time lapse, if you are using a single camera, again it works because the camera maintains its exposure. On the other hand, if you are capturing a multi-time lapse, what happens is that when you change the camera, say from wide to tele and later come back to wide, it forgets its previous exposure value. It chooses a new exposure, which may be fine by itself, but when juxtaposed with the previous exposure, it manifests as a exposure shift or a flicker. I spent some time on it. Given the time pressure of a startup, I never got around to fixing this. And there is a higher level discussion to be had about, did I run it the right way? Should I have done it better? I should have run the project better. So from a leadership point of view, that's a learning for me. But in this video, we're not talking about that. We're talking about code. So as far as the code is concerned, this is dead code. It is not actually enabled in the UI. In the UI earlier, you could enable multiple cameras. Later, we removed that feature. So when you enable one camera, the other cameras get disabled. So there is only one. So we can remove this code. See, we tried to do our own exposure calculation. Didn't work. So we can remove the multi code basically. Where is the code to change cameras? God knows where it is. Next device for time lapse is used only once, so probably switch camera for time lapse is the place that is getting invoked multiple times. Let's maybe make this refactoring one step at a time. The earlier refactoring was too big, so we got into this, but this itself looks like it's too big. Let's start by removing this code. So when it comes to refactoring, sometimes like this morning I woke up excited. I wanted to tackle something meaty, not a bunch of minor changes. But when it comes to refactoring, this instinct or desire or ambition comes in our way. Make a bunch of small changes. It's not cool. You're not excited. You're like, did I wake up for this? But can't help it. I don't even understand what's going on here. I removed this code, this call to switch camera for time lapse. Now it looks like it's not being invoked at all. This is also being invoked only once. I don't understand how the cycling is happening. Maybe I got rid of it in some other commit. These are private, so I don't need to check other classes as well. Okay, delete them. This is when I really wish I had a compiler. Or a dead code elimination tool. It uses BGRA, which means this class is a monster by itself. There's so much instrumentation code. It tracks the gap. So when you're capturing a time lapse, you have a bunch of frames, right? And you have a gap between them. You can have any gap as long as it's consistent. You can take a photo every second, let's say, or every 5 seconds, or every 3 seconds. Any of them is fine. What is not fine is doing it inconsistently. Because if you have, I don't know, a person walking on a road and you have a consistent gap, he look like he is walking at a high speed, but it's fine. Whereas if you have an inconsistent gap, it will look like he's speeding up and slowing down. I remember capturing a video of a man rowing a boat across a lake, and there was an inconsistent gap, and it looked like he was jumping forward every now and then. So he would move at a constant pace, then suddenly he would jump forward. Then again he would move at a constant pace, then suddenly jump forward. So to prevent that, you need to track the max gap. So it's like the worst case scenario thing. Processed callback. Sheesh, this also needs to be removed. A whole bunch of stuff needs to be removed. I must have removed this earlier. This camera switching code. Okay, fine, whatever. I can't leave it at whatever. I want to make sure I'm doing it right. Oh, there's a blame URL. Oh, sheesh, everything shows up in the comment in the diff. We are also hacking into the reference counting mechanism. Oh, these are extensions. Maybe I'm not reading it carefully and missing it. Yeah, these are the 4 results. Switch. Did I remove it in an earlier refactoring? Because each time we produce a frame, we would switch to the next device. Okay, whatever. I've given up now. Removing this next device for time lapse is safe because this is the only use. Removing this is safe because yeah, we found only one use. Remove some dead multi-lapse code. Awesome. We still have some nonsense about locking and unlocking devices. What are all the diffs here? One thing we should try is, can we select a subset of these diffs and commit them? So instead of changing this, which will require other changes, yeah, this can be discarded. This is too big a change for now. Yeah, this is what I can do. What was the file? AV capture session. So we had an accessor for the device. Now we have split it into 2. First you get the device input, same code as before, just that instead of returning input.device, you just return input here. Then, and of course we will change this verification failure to a crash, which is okay. I think one of the things is we engineers should be okay with crashes. We can't be perfectionists. Because if you proceed when you should crash, the code will get into a bad state and it will crash later or it will misbehave. So you're trading off one problem with another. And once you have gotten an app into a state you don't understand, you can't fix it. There's this saying, debugging is twice as hard as coding. Would you agree? I think anyone who debugs code knows that, right? We think we know it and then it's twice as hard when we actually have to debug it. So debugging is twice as hard as coding. So if you wrote the smartest code you can write, by definition you're not smart enough to debug it. So just think about that for a second. That's why I prefer simple code without unnecessary use of higher order functions. Like for example, this is easy to understand. Okay, cool. So this is cleaned up. The session has a device input and then it has a device, which is trivial. This is actually not a camera device anymore, it's just a device. It's returning any device. If you have two devices, a microphone and a camera added to your session, this will return any of them. So this entire thing would not work if you use a microphone. So far we are not using it. Like we used to use it earlier, we had a video mode. But we removed that. With that we got rid of the microphone because time lapses don't have audio. So we no longer use the microphone at all in this app. So this works. But this should not be misleading. The name should represent the logic, should reflect the logic. Now if we do have a microphone, we can do another check here to see what is the device type. So it will work. It's not that the design is flawed, just that this one. Yeah. So when you have a name that doesn't match the implementation, you have to change the implementation to match the name or the other way around. Changing the implementation can introduce bugs or unnecessary complexity, like in this case, figuring out whether it's a camera when it's always a camera. So easier to change the name. Besides, we have used the same name in other classes. There's also ease using. Return self dot device equal to device. Actually, this is not needed. How do you know whether you are using it? If the device is the same, you are using it. I do think you can compare this way in Swift. Swift has all kinds of complex, arbitrary, one-off rules. It doesn't follow like a basic set of principles that you can understand and then predict. At least in my recollection. Let a int equal to 4. I think the Swift compiler should accept this. Sometimes it gives errors saying you can't compare because one is optional, one is not. So like I said, right, the rules are like special cased a lot. So the question is, do we even need this? Having a helper function to handle a double equal to seems a little too much. Yeah, I think this type inferencing doesn't work if one is optional. So if this were a non-optional type and this were a non-optional type, then you can do this. But when one is optional, it can't type inference, type infer rather. This is also easier because if you have another function, or clearer because if you have another function, now you have to stop and think, wait, how does that work? If you have a double equal to, you know how it works. Now is this clearer? Yes, you're checking the device. At least it's no worse. The bar for a refactoring is always, is it worse, or general code changes. This applies to features also. If you have an app with some features that work in a certain way from the user's point of view and you're making a change, as long as you're not making it worse, it may not be the best feature in the world, that's okay. The bar for any launch is it worse? Because otherwise you get into perfectionism and you can never make progress. With this bar, you improve it a little. And sometimes when you improve it, people criticize saying, no, it's not perfect, it doesn't do that, it doesn't do that. And your answer should always be, the last launched version of the app doesn't do that either. So this is no worse. And yes, I'll work on that later. This to do is gone. Device. So again, see, it's more consistent now whether you do camera.device or session.device. Earlier, you had to use device or camera device depending on which class it's in. Awesome. Remove is using helper function that turned out not to be helpful actually. This is taken care of in the other commit. Typically I don't try to resolve changes because it's too much effort. I just discard it and redo it. This to do I don't want to lose. Okay. Did it pull the changes? Yes. There's also a reset device. Oh my god. So we are done with the browser version of VS Code. Let's close it. Just want to check the line length. Oh, indeed I have exceeded it. Do we have a func reset device? No, we don't. So what are the diffs now? Different callers of this function are using different subsets of functionality. Can we remove this function and have the callers do just what they need? After all, camera is not a wrapper. So originally this class camera was designed to be a wrapper so that other classes don't access the AV foundation, the iOS API for audio video capture directly. But it turned out to be too much of an abstraction. Since this is a camera app, you can't abstract it out. You shouldn't try to abstract what should not be abstracted. If you're building Twitter, then you can abstract the camera capture code because it's like 1% of the app, but not in a camera app. Okay. To do. Great. Update some to-dos and comments. This is a better commit message than some changes or minor changes, because reading that, you know, you don't have to look at the actual diffs. Say you're debugging something and you're going through the revision history to find out when the bug got introduced. These kind of commit messages are very helpful. Alright then, I think we have kind of done a good amount of work today. Let's park it here and I'll see you in the next video.